everyone, and welcome to one of the Bible Feed podcasts. And we're carrying on with a theme we are often picking up on Bible Feed. And today we've got Josh thinking about Gospel of Mark. Hello, Josh. How are you?
I'm excellent. Very excited to be here talking about this. Mark is probably my favourite of the Synoptic Gospels. Probably my favourite of all the Gospels. Possibly my favourite book in the New Testament. Even perhaps number one of the 66 at the moment for me anyway. So very excited to be talking about this short, sharp, brief Gospel.
Right. So what we're going to try and just tease through is, I guess tonight, lob some questions your way, Josh, to pique people's interest. Maybe for those who've read it a little bit before, Josh, maybe even those who've never read it at all, and even those who may be more experienced Bible readers as well. So why don't we start with a fairly simple question, which is, how do you read the Gospels? And maybe I can preface that with, I guess, in probably many contexts, the Gospels are reasonably well-trodden paths. People spend a reasonable amount of time there, given they record the events of the life of Jesus. But how do you read them when you come to, say, Mark?
Absolutely. So you're right to say they're very familiar, because large, parts of them are, I think, designed to be very familiar. The parables are easy to remember. Some of the pithy, pointed sayings that Jesus delivers to those who are listening are easy to remember. They stick in the mind like a stone in the shoe, constantly prodding us and causing us to think again. And if you were to start at the beginning of the New Testament, that maybe some people, if they're beginning reading the Bible for the very first time, might start with Matthew potentially, and read through that, and then continue on, and then come to Mark, then Luke, then John, and then look through the letters and end up in the book of Revelation at the end. Maybe that's a sort of a standard reading pattern that someone might go through. If you were to do that, when you got to Mark, you'd probably think, well, a lot of this material that I've come across, I've already had a look at in Matthew, more or less. And there's a lot of other bits in Matthew. It's quite a bit longer, but most of what I've seen here in Mark, I've seen again. And then you would get to Luke, and then you'd think, well, there's some other bits that, yes, are repeated again, slightly different layout, slightly different wording potentially in some places, but there's a lot of new material here in Luke. I've got the prodigal son, for example, those parables of the lost and so on, some sort of some big ticket items that appear only in Luke. And then you get to the Gospel of John, and then you'd have a lot of very different material in there. Again, think, okay, this is lots of the long discourses of Jesus, things like that, lots of unique material that you wouldn't have come across before. And then you're into Acts and the drama and the action and the widening of the scope there, all new stuff, echoes and links back, sure. And then we're into the letters. So Mark might sit a little bit uneasily if you read for the very first time that way, in that you just see all this material, all the sayings of Jesus, some of the parables, some of the healings, and then when you arrive in Jerusalem, the death and the crucifixion, there'd be a lot of commonality probably in your mind with what you just read in Matthew, what you're going to read in Luke. And so you might think, well, what's Mark doing in the middle here? It doesn't seem to be bringing a lot of unique material to the table, potentially. So that might be something that a sort of an initial reader might come away with.
Josh, or commonly in Christian circles, you'd often find, let's say someone's reading, let's think of an example, the story of the feeding the 5,000 or something like that, and people will bring together, let's look at it across all four Gospels and piece it all together to get the fullest story. What's your reflections on that approach as compared to, say, just reading through the Gospel of Mark as a book in itself?
It's a very natural reaction, right? You hear, I've heard certainly a lot of people say, we're given the four Gospels, these four angles, and it's our job as the reader to sort of piece them together and to sort of line them up in such a way that the composite of the four sort of slot together, puzzle-like, and then we get a full sort of understanding of who Jesus was and what his teaching was. Exactly right. That in the blend of all four, in the harmony of all four, we get the real essence or whatever it might be. And I'm not fully resistant to that way of doing it. I think there's a lot of interesting things that will come out when you read sort of with an eye in two or three or four Gospels at the same time and do that comparison work and see what is shown in one, what is echoed in another, what is highlighted in one and not found in the other. However, I do think we lose something if we only approach the Gospels that way, and if we are resistant to letting each one, and in this case we'll look at Mark, let it do what it's trying to do on its own, as it were. Imagine, if you will, if you're an initial reader of one of these Gospels, you may be, geographically in a location where you only have access to one of the four Gospels, or maybe two of the four Gospels, before the canon was complete, before we arrived at a fully formed codex of all the books that we have in the New Testament. There may well have been very many Christians who were only familiar with 1, 2, or 3 of the canonical Gospels that we have. And so I think there is an exercise, certainly for people who are familiar, who have done this a number of times or have pieced it together through looking at different sections at different times, to sit down, as it were, with Mark and resist that urge, that very natural urge to compare it to the other Gospels and to let it deliver its own message sort of in a little bit of isolation.
So let's take that approach. And could you summarize your sort of view of what you think Mark is doing as a book in itself? What's the thesis? What's Mark really trying to drive home that might be maybe distinct to the other Gospels as well?
So if you just approach Mark and read it for all it's worth, as it were, maybe with a bit of an eye on how it's going to link in with and play with and echo and resonate with the Old Testament, but to allow it to just get its own message across, what the inspired writer is putting towards us. I think you're going to really be confronted with this dramatic, this captivating and challenging gospel that is the sort of the grittiest and the sweatiest and darkest of the four Gospels. You've got a lot of conflict, you've got a lot of questions and confrontation with these demonic forces, with these political forces. It's a really interesting and exciting read, and I think it does reward repeat readings. And unlike some of the other Gospels, you can really rush through it. You can really read it at a pace, or you can carefully go through it, sort of slowly step through piece by piece. It is definitely the shortest of the four Gospels, just in word count, in length. And if you were to read it, immediately after Matthew or Luke, you'd really notice that difference, just because of the amount of material that's not present in there that is present in the others. And so I want to think about some things that, if you were to do this, some things that you could look out for in Mark to get a bit more out of it, that will sort of help you find yourself in the narrative. I don't know, if you're reading on a digital tablet, maybe you can turn off the page margins and the references and things like that, and just be conscious, especially in places where, especially if you are familiar with it, where your brain sort of wants to complete a phrase or a picture, but with words or data that isn't found in Mark. For example, Mark chapter 15, this is in verse 22, Jesus takes the loaf and he blesses it, he breaks it, he gives it to them, and he says, "Take, this is my body." And for me, I sort of insert, "Do this in remembrance of me," or some sort of words to that effect, because that's what we read in 1 Corinthians 11. That's what you see in Luke chapter 22, and you have this bit. But that isn't in Mark's recording of the Lord's Supper, before the betrayal, before the crucifixion, which we are going to get onto. But for people who are seasoned readers or hearers of the gospel, that can be quite a challenge, not to just allow your brain to sort of do the autocomplete and do the connection for you. When it's not telling you a certain something, or it is telling you a certain something, we've really got to trust the inspired writer to know what they're doing, and not to worry about trying to sort of help out and fill out the picture by bringing in what is said or what happens in the other gospels.
Yeah, that's helpful. So, Josh, so far, I think your point has been got four Gospels, but there's real merit in reading them as individual books and try not to do the autocomplete thing, read them on their own merits. So based on your reading so far, Josh, what do you think is a helpful way of reading Mark? What's some of the key themes? How did you get to that point? Maybe is a follow-up question.
Yes, yeah. So I guess there's two things maybe that we'll start with. One is the question of who Jesus is, and how that sort of haunts the reader, haunts the gospel all the way through in different ways, from different angles. Who Jesus is, understanding who he is, misunderstanding who he is, the danger of misunderstanding who he is, and so on and so forth, is something to pick up on and to sort of keep asking in your own head. And then maybe we'll think about some ways to sort of think about the structure of the book.
Make the case for why you think that's a key theme in Mark, where it might not be in the other Gospels. What's the evidence base for that?
Sure. So you have a number of places where the question is directly, more or less, asked of Jesus about his identity, about where he's getting this authority from, or who does he think he is, or how can he say these things. The identity, however, is also revealed in a really interesting way to the reader, whereas it appears that so many of the people that Jesus meets and interacts with don't know the answer that we, as the reader, are in this privileged position to know. Right from the very, very beginning. Mark 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So the game is given away there to the reader. We know who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. We're reading this, that this is a way to introduce, a way to explain who Jesus is. But the reader is in this privileged position to know that he is the Son of God. And so many people, when we get into the later chapters, are going to really struggle with understanding who Jesus is and be very interested in that answer, but aren't going to arrive at that answer as readily as we, the readers, may well be able to. Right. So, for example, chapter 2 and verse 7, Jesus has been teaching in a town called Capernaum, where he seems to be well known by the people who are there. Lots of people are coming to visit him, and Jesus forgives the sins of a paralytic in verse 5, and then some of the scribes in verse 6 are sitting there questioning in their hearts, and then we have this question, why does he speak like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? So here we have this question, this challenge of who Jesus is, these things that he's doing, these things that he's saying, where is this authority from? And we'll see that repeated variations on that in a whole host of other places. Chapter 4, verse 41, 6, verse 2, 8, 27, 29, 14, 60. There's lots and lots of places where this question is just directly asked. And we also see a number of different titles given to Jesus in different places. He's referred to as the Son of God. We saw that in verse 1 of chapter 1. There's the Son of Man title. There's the Son of David. He's referred to as Lord. And all of these different titles are used in different places that give us part of the picture of who Jesus is. And then we have the key sort of way to see this question and how it impacts those around Jesus and us as the reader. And that's in chapter 8, which I think is probably worth looking at specifically. 8 verse 29, where instead of others asking this question about Jesus' identity, we see him ask those who are around him to sort of fess up, to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Lots of people are saying lots of things about me. This is in chapter 8, sort of verses 27 to 30.
Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others, one of the prophets." And he continued by questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him.
Thank you. So here we have this two-part question and this two-part answer. First, the sort of the easier question of the group of the followers of Jesus. Who do other people say that I am? You know, what have you heard? What's the word on the street? What are people whispering behind my back? You know, what are these other reports? And the reports link him to other powerful prophetic voices of the day, John the Baptist. And then others sort of say, well, okay, you seem to be in the stead of these Old Testament characters that we're familiar with. You know, prophets, fierce confrontational prophets who do miracles, like Elijah. Maybe you're like one of the other prophets. And as we've been reading this, you might think, well, these answers, they're not entirely wrong. Jesus does share, there's a lot in common with these characters, but that's clearly not a full understanding of who he is. He's not just Elijah V2 or some sort of, resurrected Jeremiah figure. There's some commonality, there's some shared stuff there, but Jesus then goes on to sort of turn up the dial and instead focus in on those who have willingly followed him. Those who have, given up their jobs, their families, their homes, and gone out to learn from him, to commit to following him in his mission. And so in verse 29, he says, well, who do you say that I am? And we can sort of, I think, apply this to us as the reader as well. And we have the answer given by Peter, you are the Messiah. And then we have this very interesting response to this, in that Jesus does not say, no, that's incorrect, but that's is a sort of an admission that's a good and faithful answer. However, this understanding, this appreciation of who he is and what he's doing should not be spread abroad at this time.
So, Josh, your thesis is that a big part of Mark is about identity and who Jesus is. And maybe just tease up for us. So some of those passages that you went to are found in other Gospels. So what is it that makes you feel that this is something that's particularly a theme in Mark? Maybe, because I haven't checked, but some of those, for example, you might find in some of the other Gospels. Is it the density of references? Is it the way it's structured? How have you got to the conclusion that that's something that Mark is really drawing on, maybe more than others?
You do have a certain amount of density in sort of the first half of the Gospel, this idea of orienting yourself in the Gospel. I take one way of thinking about the structure of Mark is what happens before this section in chapter 8 and what happens afterwards. Because after the willingness of Peter to correctly identify who Jesus is, some of the teaching that Jesus then begins to focus on, and we'll see that sort of repeated in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And you're absolutely right. Yes, this is not something that is not shown in the other Gospels, but this is certainly something that is repeated a whole host of times often in the pre sort of chapter 8 sections as part of confrontations. People will seek Jesus out in order to ask this question of him, or because of the healing that is done, the challenge that is perceived by those who are in positions of power in the day. The default response towards the end becomes planning of violence and trying to get rid of this threat. But the initial response is to question his identity. The identity that has been identified to us, the reader, has been sort of confirmed by the voice from heaven at the baptism of Jesus in the early part of Mark. This identity that's going to then be confirmed in the mouth of another very unlikely candidate of the centurion at the cross at the very end that we'll think about. And the other voices early on in Mark's Gospel are the voices of those who are, in the language of the Gospel, possessed by demons. They know and recognize Jesus from afar off and realize what he is doing and what he is about to a much greater extent than a lot of those who are willingly following him, as well as obviously those who are challenged by him.
I guess maybe to build on that, you were saying earlier that you want to read Mark in isolation. Actually here, one of the tools you're using is you're actually almost comparing, contrasting Mark versus other Gospels to try and get to this point where actually this becomes a theme. That's quite different a way of reading the Gospel, where you're sort of filling in gaps, isn't it? I suppose you're actively almost looking at where difference exists to say, well, Mark starts by telling the reader something that no other Gospel starts in quite the same way. That kind of, I guess, is a pretty hefty hint. This is probably something you really want to watch out for as you read this Gospel.
Absolutely.
And the comparison with the others is helpful by contrast, more than filling in gaps. Is that fair?
100%. I mean, let's take the key lead-ins that we see in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. We have a lot of interest shown in what happens before Jesus arrives on the scene in both of those Gospels. We have the genealogies in both. Lots of links back. So, okay, well, this is part of Jesus is linked intrinsically with the history of Israel, and we've got mention of all these Old Testament characters. So that would prompt the reader to go back and to think about them. Here in Mark, we don't have any of the birth narratives. We don't have Joseph and Mary, the flight to Egypt. All of that sort of stuff is not here. We don't have any of the John the Baptist, Zechariah, Elizabeth material. All the sort of lead up, the sort of the introduction, the sort of the warming everyone and getting us situated and sat down and the table laid out nicely to then introduce Jesus. Mark just drops us in this incredible, exciting way with this sort of blast from this quotation from Isaiah with blended bits of Malachi in there as well. We have a quick introduction to John, who's baptizing in the wilderness, and he's saying that there's going to be someone else coming after me. That's 4 verses. And then verse 9, in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. And as soon as he had come up out of the water, this soon as, this immediately language, this and then these things sort of happen after one another. Not a lot of, scene set up and sort of narrative to fill in these gaps. We have these incredibly action-packed, episodic sort of events happening. And then we have this, the language of the heavens being torn open, this rent asunder, this sort of schism language, right from the very, very beginning. Jesus sort of arrives in this sort of explosive, incredibly exciting and exhilarating manner, not exactly out of nowhere, but compared to the sort of the lengthy introductions to help the reader understand and orient and situate themselves that we see in Matthew and Luke and in John as well. We begin right as the ministry begins. We have John being arrested in verse 14 of chapter 1, and then Jesus begins proclaiming the good news of God, saying the time is up. We're already into the action. We haven't even got to verse 20 yet of the very first chapter. And then we've got the call of those fishermen, these common laborers. That's how the mission begins, with Jesus calling people to himself, asking them to follow him, asking them to investigate and to trust and to understand who he is and why he is doing this, without a whole big preamble.
As you were talking there, I was thinking you are sort of gradually unpicking your method here a little bit about how you're reading as well, which may be helpful for people. So maybe, Josh, do you have a view on, it maybe as a Western way of viewing the world, but we often like to sort of segment biblical books into sort of sections and to try and help give a frame. And I've heard people talk about the first 7-8 chapters are like, who is Jesus? This kind of question of identity. Then 8 to 10 is Jesus explaining who he is, and then in the final chapters, it's like how he becomes Messiah through his death and resurrection and so on. But like, what do you think is a helpful way to think about the frame of, or the structure of Mark, or maybe the themes of Mark as they go through?
I would recommend, if you can, there's a number of translations of Mark that dispense with the chapters and the verse headings and structure it just sort of as a piece of written work that you should just run straight through. And I think it does really lend itself to doing that. You're confronted when you begin Matthew or Luke with the things like the genealogies and stuff that they're going through incredibly slowly and thinking about why is all this here and who are all these people and what does that mean. Mark really invites you to read it in one. A lot of people think also that it was originally written with sort of oral performance in mind, and there are people who commit it to memory and perform it live because it's obviously the shortest, but equally in terms of sort of having it as a text to perform from, it lends itself to that. So I would certainly recommend trying, if you're interested in this sort of thing, in reading it all the way through, unencumbered by the idea of structure and where you are or anything like that, and allow yourself to just rush through it at full pace to see what that brings out. For me, there's probably 2 bits, if you are going a bit slower, to think about, okay, well, where am I in the gospel? For me, that section in chapter 8, verse 29-ish, the sort of the before and after to a certain extent, because what we see after that is Jesus will continually start to talk about, in very, very clear, specific language, with no uncertain terms, about his death, that he is going to Jerusalem, that there is going to be this confrontation, and that is part of his plan, and that his allegiance to God, his Father, and the plan and purpose that is being outworked in him is something that's very challenging for those who are listening, and they don't fully quite get it, and so they try to get it, and Jesus has to correct them and work with them. And that sort of happens repeatedly in chapters 8, 9, and 10, in this sort of very quite clear sort of repeated motif that you don't see highlighted in such a stark way prior to this, the sort of acknowledgement of Peter in chapter 8. The other way that I think is also quite interesting is to sort of break the gospel broadly into 3. At the beginning, Jesus is mostly in the north of Israel, in the Galilee, and a lot of the way he travels around is by getting into a boat and moving along or across the Sea of Galilee. Then broadly coinciding with our sort of chapter 8. We don't see him using boats anymore. He's walking on the road or in the way, and people are following him on the road, and Jesus is leading them on the road. And then in the sort of the third of our division, he arrives in Jerusalem, which is where and around where he's going to sort of be based for the sort of the final third of the gospel. And he's in and around Jerusalem, and we're not traveling anywhere. We're all focused on what is taking place with the confrontations in Jerusalem, the temple, the cursing of the fig tree, so on and so forth. So all of that is in and around the city itself. And so if you're sort of, dipping into various different places in Mark, you could ask yourself, okay, well, is Jesus leading us on the road? Is Jesus using boats to travel? Are we willing to follow him all the way to Jerusalem, or have we arrived in Jerusalem? So for me, those are two, I think, pretty simple but pretty helpful ways to think about the kind of the structure and where you might find yourself in the gospel if you're dipping in and out.
I have heard, I think you say this, Josh, before, that at the start of Mark's gospel, you get like the heavens opening, and then God speaks and says, "It's my son." And then at the end, you get the veil of the temple opening, and then the centurion speaks. So there is, even though you've got these, I guess you could call them sections if you wanted to, there is these sort of arcs that kind of hang across the whole thing as well.
Exactly,
I don't know if they're
right. No, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that rent-tearing schism language, you see in those two places. So yeah, accompanied by the acceptance, the confirmation of who Jesus is, as well as the third one there that you have is the high priest tearing his garment, that is tearing his robe at the claims that are being made in the trial scene, unwilling to acknowledge and like the other two voices, identify Jesus correctly in terms of what Mark is presenting to us. The other point, I suppose, on that, with this idea of thinking about structure, you might come across in sort of wider reading and things like that, people talk about the simplicity of Mark as compared to something like a Matthew or a Luke, either in terms of the Greek language or the structure or the detail of what's presented in there. But I really do think that, as are all the Gospels, Mark really is a work of absolute genius. One, if it is the first gospel, that this is a truly, craftworkian, genre-defining, genre-creating work, fully unlike the sort of the examples of ancient biography that you can look like. It shares some elements with that, of course, but nothing that asks the reader so often to engage with the full life of this and teaching of this person, that holds up examples of people who responded to him positively and negatively as examples, as challenges, as something to engage and potentially inspire and demand a sort of a reaction or a sort of a confirmation or a denial from the reader. We teach the Gospels and the parables and these examples in Sunday school because they're so easy to understand. But yet, there's so much sort of depth and richness and challenge and complexity that's in here that I think that's one of the reasons why I'm really keen to try and read Mark on its own, because I think it is doing so much and trying to push us in so many interesting ways if we look at it, with blinkers on. And although there's all this wonderful, amazing stuff, Sermon on the Mount, Prodigal Son in the other Gospels that we don't have here, but that's okay. Mark is through the work of inspiration trying to help or to instruct or correct or do something with the reader.
But maybe we'll finish with two questions. Anything else you thought was worth piquing people's interest in that they can think about themselves? And then maybe the final question would be around, as followers of Jesus or people getting closer to understanding more about Christianity and stuff, what's the sort of points that people can take away from reading the Gospel of Mark? But maybe we'll start with, is there anything else you wanted to draw out as surprise people or intrigue people about the way that Mark is written, or some detail in it?
Yeah, okay. So one that I think is a bit nerdy, but is quite interesting when you see it happen, is how are there, there's some examples, I think, where Mark is trying to help the reader out. He's sort of trying to do a bit of either translation work or explanation work in order to help the reader get the most out of what is being presented. And when you see that, it's quite interesting where that comes up. So, for example, the book is very concerned with discipleship. People who are defined by their allegiance to Jesus, who are transformed by this idea of new creation, of the kingdom that he's talking about, this thing that can cross ethnic and social boundaries, the compassion for the poor and the destitute, having this faith that in the language that Jesus uses can move mountains and can endure persecution and can be persistent in prayer. Jesus talks about what it is to respond to that, to be a disciple. And one of the things that I think Mark is doing is trying to help people, come to terms with that. One is where Mark does a bit of sort of translation work to help the initial reader be familiar with what he's talking about. So there's one in Mark chapter 12 and verse 42, and there's another one in Mark 15 verse 16. So I'll just show you these two.
Mark 12:42. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which amount to a cent.
And so then Mark 15 verse 16 says, the soldiers led him, Jesus, away into the palace, that is the governor's residence, and called the whole company together. So in these two, we see here that Mark is doing a bit of, xe.com work. He's doing some currency conversion for the people who are reading here, because he's providing, the direct detail of what was happening in Jesus' life. What was the coin that was being given. But there's this idea that potentially the people who are reading this don't use that currency, and so he's saying, the amount was, $3, which is about, I don't know, my currency conversion is terrible. I don't know, €1.50 or something like that. And if you read that, you're thinking, oh, okay, well, probably the people who are reading this are in the EU or they're in a euro using country, because otherwise, why would you explain it that sort of way? So that's just a very a small point, but it shows at least a little bit of willingness to help out those who are reading, who maybe are in a different country or use a different currency. The one in chapter 15 is a similar sort of thing. It's taking the Greek term and then explaining it with a more Latin sort of Roman type term. So some people think that, hey, maybe this means that initial readers are more likely to be from a Roman background. The other really interesting one, I think, which is much longer and sort of stands out much more, is in the beginning of Mark chapter 7. There we have this sort of long extended explanation of Jewish practice about the washing of hands. In my Bible, it puts it in brackets to sort of to highlight and say, well, this is the explanation. The Pharisees have come and they're going to ask Jesus this question, because they've observed that some of his disciples are eating bread with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. And then we have this long sort of thing about, well, the Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, keeping the tradition of the elders. Now, why would this all be included if the initial readers were Jewish and did this anyway, or were familiar with this practice because this was how everyone around them did it? So again, some people think, well, okay, well, this is interesting. Mark is trying to help the reader here. He's giving this extra information. Interestingly, this is not included in the Matthew retelling of this exact same incident. You have the intro bit and you have the question, but you don't have the explanation in the middle. There's this idea that, Mark is trying to help out the readers by adding in this material, possibly because they're not so familiar with this practice that would have been normal to Jesus and the disciples and those in the area. It's not an uncommon practice, but if you are in Rome, if you are somewhere further flung in the empire using different currency, not familiar with the local practices, Mark is trying to help you out here.
Other examples of that are, he explains like Aramaic or Hebrew phrases, doesn't he? Like, means this, or just trying to find one of the other one.
Yeah, there's a few more that, it tends to be, that's another one. Yeah, exactly right. It tends to be going to, and the sort of the target or the destination language is more the Latin version of the word, which is why people then make this inference about the initial audience, or at least that Mark maybe has his eye on a very wide audience that could encompass people within the land of Israel, people in Jerusalem, as well as those outside of it as well.
So last question, Josh, is what do either people coming afresh to Mark's Gospel take from some of this? Because I guess what you've talked to tonight is some of the artistry involved. You described it as a work of genius. What does someone coming afresh get from it? And how does it sort of change their life? And equally for the more experienced Bible reader, what do they take?
Sure. Well, I think for me, I'd probably end by thinking about some of the really powerful imagery that we see included in the way that Mark presents and records and displays the crucifixion and the reaction of those around it to the reader. I've got a case in point that sort of demonstrates this. People are challenged all the way through the gospel with who Jesus is. He seems kingly in some ways. He seems prophetic in some times. He's a healer. He can teach these incredible lessons. He can command these huge crowds, but he keeps subverting people's expectations and zigging when they think he should zag and so on. He's in Galilee. He moves on the way to Jerusalem, but people are trying to follow him and they struggle and they fall away because his message becomes very challenging about, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. This is part of the plan. I'm going to be taken. I'm not going to, kick out the Romans and reestablish the country in the way that people might want me to. What kind of king is Jesus? What kind of Messiah is he, if he is the Messiah? And the fame reaches out really fast, and the crowds seem to become a bit of a problem, and the speed keeps on ramping up, and the energy gets higher and higher as Jesus approaches the city. And then when we get to Mark chapter 15, when Jesus is on the cross, we spend all this time with Jesus, calling people to be followers of him, to listen to his words, to go with him on the boat, to go with him on the road, to stay with him, to sort of last the course. And then in chapter 15, he's on the cross. He gives this loud cry. He breathes his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two, that part that we spoke about from top to bottom, just like the heavens were torn at the beginning. And then verse 39, the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last. He said, "Truly this man was God's son." And then for me, we have just this incredible, this for me is really is keying into the genius of this book. We have this just bizarre placement of verses 40 and 41. We're at the ultimate moment. And then Mark, the camera pans away and we turn away from the cross and we sort of zoom, way over there. And then in verse 40, it says, "There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem." Now, why is this placed here? If I was a teacher in a sixth form or something like this, and I was grading this as a novel, I think, why have you waited to the climax moment? This is such weird writing. What's going on here? Why would you wait all this time to tell us this? These women had been here the whole time. Why didn't you mention it back when we were in Galilee, back when we were in the boats bit, where you're sort of going out and asking people, where Jesus is bringing people to him and taking him along the road? That's what Luke does. Luke does that way back in chapter 8. He introduces these women to him. It makes total sense. That's where Jesus is introduced to them. That's where we would be introduced to them. But I think Mark is not doing that. He's too clever for that. He's working on this other level. He's cruising at 30,000 feet, and he wants to hold this information in the back pocket, sort of like this clenched fist behind the back, to then bring it out at the darkest moment. We then focus on these super women who did not abandon Jesus, who did not fall away like the 12 who struggled with the message. They were at the beginning. You didn't even know it, Mark's saying, but I knew. And Jesus knew. They stuck it out. They're here at the finish line with Jesus. When he gives up, they're there in the front row. They're the ones who are willing to put themselves in danger when it counts. All the others have fallen away. They haven't been able to continue with Jesus. And these women here are the only ones, it seems, on the planet who think Jesus is still worth the trouble. And they're so convinced in their discipleship to still honor him, even in his death, by giving him a proper burial, one that the others were not able to do. And so this focus on those who can continue as disciples, I think, after what would appear to be even the apparent end of the Jesus movement, they are still duty-bound. They are still willing and able to put in an appearance and to continue the work in their master's service, even if they are, blinded by grief and confused and challenged, looking and longing for that resurrection that he's talked about. But they're still willing then to make an appearance here. I think that might be one of the challenges to the reader of the gospel, this idea of continued commitment, even in the face of persecution, even in the face of challenge. And then, the women who are highlighted here, right at the very, very end, is this sort of this way to sort of pique the reader and say, well, okay, well, for models of what it looks like to follow Jesus, someone who is able to continue in the way despite the challenges, despite the questions of who he really is and where his authority comes from, to stay committed, following Jesus in the way, on the road, even if it leads to Jerusalem.
Thanks, Josh. So I hope you've sort of piqued people's interest in Mark and what Mark is trying to do. And it felt like tonight what you really talked to, Josh, was some of the genius of the book, how it differs with some of the other Gospels, and this big sort of thrust about identity, and these examples of where we see like Mark almost hiding in his back pocket this particular detail right at the end to reveal what true following of Jesus looks like. And there's plenty I'm sure we didn't cover the key words in Mark. I'm sure that's something for another day. Thanks a lot, and otherwise we'll catch you all soon. Toodle bit.
Thanks, everyone.